The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was a direct and dangerous confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and was the moment when the two superpowers came closest to nuclear conflict. The crisis was unique in several ways, featuring calculations and miscalculations, as well as direct and secret communications and miscommunications between the two sides. The dramatic crisis was also characterized by the fact that it was primarily played out at the White House and the Kremlin level with relatively little input from the respective bureaucracies typically involved in the foreign policy process. After the failed U.S. attempt to overthrow the Castro regime in Cuba with the Bay of Pigs invasion, and while the Kennedy administration planned Operation Mongoose in July 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev reached a secret agreement with Cuban Premier Fidel Castro to place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba to deter any future invasion attempt. President John F. Kennedy went on national television to inform the public of the development in Cuba, his decision to initiate and enforce a quarantine, and the potential global consequences if the crisis continued to escalate. The tone of the president's remarks were stern, and the message unmistakable and evocative of the Monroe Doctrine. President Kennedy goes on to say, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launch from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union."
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
On that day, the Joint Chiefs of Staff announced a military readiness status of DEFCON 3. On October 24th, Khrushchev responded to Kennedy's message with a statement that the U.S. blockade was an act of aggression and that the Soviet ships bound for Cuba would be ordered to proceed. Nevertheless, during October 24th and 25th, some ships turned back from the quarantine line. Others were stopped by U.S. naval forces, but they contained no offensive weapons and so were allowed to proceed. Meanwhile, U.S. reconnaissance flights over Cuba indicated the Soviet missile sites were nearing operational readiness. With no apparent end to the crisis in sight, U.S. forces were placed at DEFCON 2, meaning war was imminent. On October 26, Kennedy told his advisors it appeared that only a U.S. attack on Cuba would remove the missiles, but he insisted on giving the diplomatic channel a little more time. The crisis had reached a virtual stalemate. That afternoon, however, the crisis took a dramatic turn. ABC News correspondent John Scali reported to the White House he had been approached by a Soviet agent suggesting an agreement could be reached in which the Soviet would remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States promised not to invade the island. Khrushchev sent Kennedy a message the evening of October 26, which meant it was sent in the middle of the night, Moscow time. It was a long, emotional message that raised the specter of the nuclear holocaust and presented a proposed resolution that remarkably resembled what Scali reported earlier that day. "If there is no intention," he said, "to doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, let us take measures to untie that knot. We are ready for this." Was the world ready for this? Can you imagine what it must have felt for those Americans in 1962 as the United States and the Soviet Union were on the brink of a nuclear exchange? Probably not. But this is an example of the tension between President Zelensky and Putin, which they are engaged in at this very moment.
There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The Cold War ended when President Ronald Reagan and General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev took the first steps towards peace. Three events heralded the end of the Cold War: the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.
Reporting tonight from Berlin.
From the Berlin Wall specifically, take a look at them. They've been there since last night. They are here in the thousands. They are here in the tens of thousands. Occasionally they shout, Die Mauer muss weg, the wall must go. Thousands and thousands of West Germans come to make the point that the wall has suddenly become irrelevant. Something, as you can see, almost to party on. How do you measure such an astonishing moment in history?
And the reunification of Germany in 1990.
Sicherheit von Weizsäcker.
And the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Each was brought about or shaped by the demands and actions of ordinary Europeans who were determined to instigate change. So I ask you, don't the Ukrainians and the Russians have the same determination? That is, to instigate change. After President Reagan, the Department of State's officials and President George W. Bush's foreign policy team were reluctant to speak publicly about German reunification due to the fear that hardliners in both the German Democratic Republic, GDR, and the Soviet Union would stymie reform. Although changes in the GDR leadership and encouraging speeches by Gorbachev about non-intervention in Eastern Europe boded well for reunification, the world was taken by surprise when during the night of November 9th, 1989, crowds of Germans began dismantling the Berlin Wall, a barrier that for almost 30 years had symbolized the Cold War division of Europe. By October 1990, Germany was reunified, triggering the swift collapse of other Eastern European regimes. 13 months later, on December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics dissolved. President Bush and his chief foreign policy advisors were more proactive towards Russia and the former Soviet republics after the collapse of the communist monolith than when it was teetering. In a series of summits during the next year with the new Russian president Boris Yeltsin, Bush pledged $4.5 billion to support economic reform in Russia, as well as additional credit guarantees and technical assistance. The two former Cold War adversaries lifted restrictions on the numbers and movement of diplomatic, consular, and official personnel. They also agreed to continue the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty negotiations, START, begun before the collapse of the Soviet Union. which set a goal of reducing their strategic nuclear arsenals from approximately 12,000 warheads to 3,000 to 3,500 warheads by 2003. In January 1993, 3 weeks before leaving office, Bush traveled to Moscow to sign the START II treaty that codified those nuclear reductions. So my point here is that diplomacy worked well versus aggressive and chest-pounding political rhetoric. I think the same possibilities apply to Russia and the Ukrainian government as long as NATO can reassure that Ukraine remain neutral and a cohesive agreement between Russia and the Ukraine be promoted versus provoking further military violence or further attempts to induct Ukraine into NATO. I think the Russian Federation has a legitimate fear of NATO surrounding the country's borders. So why not, for the sake of peace, dispense with this alliance with the Ukrainian country if it prevents further bloodshed, if it creates a spirit of trust between NATO and the Russian Federation? Why not?